Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Sri Lanka College of Hematologists, I would like to warmly welcome you for the Young Hematologists Forum. Today, there are three speakers are waiting to share their experience which they have gathered during their overseas training. So, without taking much time, let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Hirosha Fernando, Acting Consultant Hematologist attached to Teaching Hospital Mahamodara. She's going to talk about an experience she has gathered during her overseas training regarding managing a rare variant of sickle cell disease. So over to you, Hirosha.
Thank you, Nadishani. Hello, everyone. Good evening. First of all, let me thank the organizing team for giving me this opportunity. As you can see on the screen, I'm here to present today the story of Miss J with a rare variant of sickle cell disease. I'm Dr. Hirosha Fernando from Teaching Hospital, Mahamodara. So Miss J is a 14-year-old Omani girl with sickle cell disease. One day she presented to A&E with acute onset severe left-sided headache coupled with heaviness and numbness of right upper limb and lower limb. She denied fever, vomiting or photophobia, but reported several months history of recurrent episodes of headache alternating to left and right side of the head. But these symptoms were managed as migraine for some time, but she didn't report weakness of the body throughout during this period. On examination, she was fully conscious, alert, pale and icteric but afebrile, hemodynamically stable, lungs were clear, no hepatosplenomegaly. Urological examination was normal except vague numbness of left upper and lower limbs. Sensory and motor function remained normal. And after the clinical history taken in the examination, the differential diagnoses were hemiplegic migraine and stroke with background sickle cell disease. Her past records were reviewed and they revealed that sickle cell was detected at the age of 9 months, that was in 2006, when she presented with fever, pallor and jaundice and mild splenomegaly. At that time, she had moderate anemia. And the significant feature is MCV and MCH was low, but high MCHC and high RDW. Platelet was slightly high and the neutrophil was predominant. Hemolytic markers were strongly positive and liver transaminases, renal functions were normal. Ferritin was a bit high, that was 346. 3D enzyme activity was normal. In Oman, the prevalence of D6PD was very high. So each and every time when a new patient comes, they are doing D6PD enzyme activity as a routine investigations. Serology for hepatitis B, C, HIV was negative. And chest X-ray, there were mild cardiomegaly in this infant. And then echo showed normal left ventricular ejection fraction. Ultrasound scan, there was mild splenomegaly, but liver, gallbladder was normal. Blood group, prior to the initiation of transfusion, it was ORH positive and she was KEL negative and antibody screening was negative. So I went through the blood picture report, which was mentioned in the records, and they have noted that hypochromic necrocytic cells, sickle cells, and Napoleon head cells, polychromasia and rular formation, and there were mild neutrophil leukocytosis with toxic changes in the neutrophil. Platelets were increased, and impression at that time was reactive morphology with background sickle cell disease. Hemoglobinopathy screening was done to this infant when at that time she was 9 months old. So it revealed very high amount of HbF, that was 60.9, and there were two hemoglobin variants. One was eluted at S window, and that was later detected as hemoglobin S and confirmed as hemoglobin S. And in the C window also there was a small peak and later detected as hemoglobin S Oman, because hemoglobin S Oman behaves as hemoglobin C on the HPLC. So parents were screened and by HPLC and detected that father was carrier for sickle, and mother was carrier for sickle Oman. Both were asymptomatic and they were not detected until that time. And later in the life, she had two brothers, and they were also positive for heterozygous sickle, classical sickle. So this girl, the parents and the infants, the index case, hemoglobin electrophoresis was done. That was in acid medium. So in the control, this is not that clear. Sorry for that. In the control acid medium, this is the anode and this is the cathode. So it moves like this direction. So this is hemoglobin F, and then A, S, C, as you know in your postgraduate knowledge. So this is mother's strip, and this is father's strip, and this is the baby. So mother is positive, father is positive for A, and father has A band and as well as S band. Mother has A band as well as C band. But her blood film, there was Napoleon had cells. So they thought that this is hemoglobin S Oman. This is usually elute with hemoglobin C. And in baby had both classical sickle as well as sickle Oman. So she is compound heterozygous for hemoglobin S, hemoglobin sickle Oman disease. Further, the alpha and beta globin DNA analysis by PCR was made, and beta gene, it showed substitution of 6th codon glutamate by valine, and then there were other band. They are, in addition to this sickle, classical sickle mutation, it was combined with other mutation, that is 121 position codon, that means amino acid was replaced, glutamic amino acid was replaced by the lysine, and these two has happened on the same beta gene. Alpha genes, she didn't had any alpha gene mutation. So the diagnosis was confirmed as sickle cell disease due to hemoglobin sickle Oman disease. So now we will discuss about the sickle Oman. So today I am going to discuss what is sickle Oman, molecular basis in pathology, clinical presentations, laboratory workup, and this girl's presentation was CNS manifestation and how we are going to manage CNS manifestations of sickle cell disease. So sickle cell disease is one of the commonest monogenic diseases with severe and potentially life-threatening manifestations. It affects millions of people worldwide with severe complications, and it had negative impact on these patients' quality of life and survival because most of the days in their life has to spend in the hospital. So there are several types of sickle cell disease. As you know, the most commonest is hemoglobin SS disease. And the other, and this represents almost 2/3 of the sickle cell disease. And 1/3 is represented by hemoglobin SC disease. And hemoglobin S beta and hemoglobin S beta plus is also not uncommon. But there are other rare sickle cell disease genotypes. Those are hemoglobin SD disease, hemoglobin SE disease, hemoglobin SS Oman disease, and hemoglobin SO Arab disease. So what is sickle Oman? It is a rare, very rare genotype, first described by Langdon and team in 1999 on an Omani patient in USA. It was named as sickle Oman due to high prevalence in Omani population. Only occasional case reports and small series of patients with hemoglobin S Oman have been described in the literature. So this is the red cell which contain hemoglobin S Oman, and some are referring this cell to a Napoleon hat, and some are described it as ball of yarn and knitted needle. So molecular basis, as you know, red cell has hemoglobin. Hemoglobin has 2 alpha genes, 2 beta genes in addition to the heme molecule. So hemoglobin beta gene is located in the chromosome 11, while alpha gene is located in the chromosome 16. So when we come to the beta gene and when we explore it, it has 3 exons, 2 intervening segments and 2 unrelated, untranslated regions. So what happened in hemoglobin S, that is classical hemoglobin S, the 6th codon which was located in the exon N was replaced, the glutamic acid was replaced by the valine. But in hemoglobin S Oman, the combination of this exon N mutation, that is classical glutamate to valine mutation, and it has another mutation that is in exon T3 at 121 location, that glutamate is replaced by the lysine. If we find this mutation alone, then that is ORF. That is ORF. So exon 2, exon 1, exon 3, there are 2 mutations. So it is double substituted hemoglobin with dominant clinical phenotype. So what is pathophysiology? Usually normal hemoglobin has interactions with red cell membrane. Deoxyhemoglobin S, when deoxyhemoglobin is at red cell membrane, it alters number of red cell membrane properties like ATP release, charge, those properties. But when hemoglobin is, this is normal deoxyhemoglobin. When normal hemoglobin S, when sickle hemoglobin S is at red cell membrane, it gains unusually high permeability, and this permeability is mediated by activation of 3 transporters. Those are potassium cotransporter, sickle and Gardner's channel, and this mediates solute loss and red cell linkage. But in hemoglobin S Oman, in addition to these properties, it has an additional supercycline properties, and those properties are still not revealed. So, but the morphology, the Napoleon head-shape morphology, that means red cell phenotype, has not yet been fully exposed. So, a small comparison between classical sickle and the Oman sickle. So, classical sickle is autosomal recessive condition. So, to get the disease, we need both 2 mutations. Both alleles should have mutations. So, in homozygous sickle, HPLC, the sickle percentage is usually more than 90, and patients are symptomatic, and in the blood smear you will see the sickle cells. But in heterozygous sickle, where hemoglobin S is less than 50%, and they are usually asymptomatic, they are silent carriers, and their morphology in the blood film also normal. But when you come to the heterozygous sickle Oman, the percentage is lesser than this, but they are symptomatic. They have the disease, and in the morphology, in the peripheral blood, the characteristic Napoleon head cells are there. When you come to the homozygous sickle Oman, that is not compatible with life, and we don't have patients like this, but we have small amount of patients who carry standard classical sickle as well as sickle Oman, that is heterozygous, like our patient, compound heterozygosity, like our patient. So they have some amount of hemoglobin that is usually falls between 20 to 30, and hemoglobin S is usually 14 to 22. They are symptomatic. They behave as sickle cell anemia, and in the morphology, peripheral smear, you will see both classical sickle cells as well as Napoleon head cells. So comparison illustrates the great ability of hemoglobin S Oman, even at low level, cause disease. So it is a double substituted hemoglobin with dominant clinical phenotype. we are telling these sickle hemoglobin as super sicklers, because when we are exposed to zero oxygen tension, that is fully deoxygenated state, all the cell become the sickling, all the cells converted to sickle shape. Even at fully oxygenated states also we are getting sickle cell. But in sickle cell anemia, classical sickle cell anemia, if patient is fully oxygenated, you will not see sickle cells. But in sickle Oman, even in heterozygote states, you will get in fully oxygenated state also you are getting this shape of cells. So there are, as sickle cell disease, the clinical presentations, it is multiple because sickle affect all parts of the body. So I don't go into very much of details. So if we get a patient at the first time, so diagnostic workup should be as I did for this child. It should be hematological, blood bank, biochemical and viral, and then blood film morphology. In sickle Oman, blood film morphology is diagnostic, and then the sickling test, and this is confirmed by hemoglobin analysis by HPLC, hemoglobin electrophoresis, and genetics testing, like we are exploring the alpha and beta globin gene clusters by PCR. So come back to the previous the child initial presentation at the age of 9 months. So according to these findings, the diagnosis was made as hemolytic crisis of sickle cell disease precipitated by acute infection. So that time, child was managed with IV antibiotics and blood transfusions, and then folic acid. Pneumococcal vaccination was scheduled and oral penicillin prophylaxis was started. She was followed up at outpatient clinic and she was well and active for some time. But the life was not so good for this child. At the age of 3 years, she had recurrent tonsillitis, usually 5 to 6 episodes over 6 months, so underwent tonsillectomy. Thereafter also, she had multiple admissions with splenic sequestration in child. Splenic sequestration. The doctors offered splenectomy, but parents refused. She was started on hydroxyurea therapy according to the body weight. And in addition to that, she had frequent episodes of A&E visits for recurrent crisis, hemolytic crisis, explosive crisis. And she was on frequent on-demand transfusion that causes rising of ferritin, elation with depleted also commits. So current admission, she came with neurological manifestations, and the laboratory investigations revealed again moderate anemia, and blood film was compatible with sickle cell disease. No acute infection, no active hemolysis. Hemolytic markers were normal, and then septic workup was negative. So at that time also we did a HPLC that showed hemoglobin S of 13.2, hemoglobin SO1 6.2, and total was 20%. And then blood group was Rh negative, and by that time she had developed allo antibodies due to frequent transfusion, and she was positive for KLN anti-Big C. And autoimmune workup done because she had stroke, and that was negative. Serum ferritin was slightly high, and then other staining was negative. And imagine contrast in a CT brain was normal. So we should avoid CT these type of in this group of diseases, because most of the time they are negative. But MRI brain at the same time indicated 3 areas representing acute infarctions in left frontal as well as occipital lobes. MRA, that is the angiogram that showed narrowing at the posterior circulation and possible narrowing at the branch of middle cerebral artery with vascular wall irregularity, raising the possibility of Moyamoya disease. There was no cerebral venous thrombosis. So cerebral manifestations of sickle cell disease are the complications most devastating, causing most devastating sequelae in sickle cell disease. The commonest is silent cerebral infarction, and thereafter overt stroke, and then cognitive morbidity. and these are irreversible CNS damages. About 25% of sickle cell disease patients have neurological event in their lifetime. So moyamoya disease in sickle cell disease is due to stenosis and occlusion of the large arteries of the circle of Willis, with resultant collateral formation. So these are collaterals, and in the MRA it is like this, and some refer this sign as puff of smoke. So up to now, the summary: a 14-year-old girl with sickle cell disease, compound heterozygous for classical sickle as well as sickle Oman, with prior episodes of clinic sequestration, recurrent hemolytic crisis, and painful veno-occlusive crisis, warranting on-demand red cell transfusion, hydroxyurea, Deferricerox, folic acid, oral penicillin since early childhood, presented to A&E with acute onset severe left side headache coupled with numbness and heaviness of right side of the body, found to have hemoglobin of 9.4, total hemoglobin S of 20%, negative for hemolytic and septic markers, and acute cerebral infarction and Moyamoya syndrome on imaging. So according to the ASH guidelines in 2020, when a child sickle cell disease patient presented with acute event of cerebral head, brain, CNS, acute manifestation of CNS, we have to do prompt blood transfusion upon recognition of the symptoms within 2 hours of presentation. And extended transfusion is preferred over simple transfusion. If extended transfusion is not available within 2 hours, or if the hemoglobin is less than 8.5, simple transfusion can be performed. So coming to the current admission, we managed the patient. The initial management was done with hydration, antibiotics, analgesics, and then after that extended transfusion. And the post-transfusional hemoglobin S was 7.8. Her symptoms was almost completely resolved within few days of transfusion. She was offered regular simple transfusion at 4-weekly interval thereafter, along with her other routine medications. So we have a question now: will her clinical condition remain same, or will it worse in due course? So according to the American Heart Association and American Stroke Association primary stroke prevention guidelines, unless long-term transfusion therapy is provided, 70 to 90% of children with sickle cell disease who experience a single stroke have subsequent events. So this is published in Blood Journal in 2016 that shows that without transfusion, they can get they have very high prevalence of strokes, that is second stroke, and with hydroxyurea and transfusion therapy, regular transfusion and daily hydroxyurea therapy, it can be reduced, events can be reduced. So secondary prevention, according to the ASH guidelines, regular blood transfusion, you should give regular blood transfusion, that is at 3 to 4 weeks interval, to maintain the hemoglobin above 9 gram per dl at all the time, and then hemoglobin S level 30% of total hemoglobin until the time of next transfusion. Erythrocytoparesis is another alternative method to simple transfusion. In here, they selectively remove the hemoglobin S containing sickle cells and rapidly reduce the hemoglobin S concentration to less than 30%. And it will avoid the increased post-transfusion hemoglobin, which can usually follows after extended transfusion. So for adults and children with sickle cell disease, Moyamoya syndrome, and stroke and TIA, we need to evaluate for revascularization surgery in addition to regular blood transfusion. So this is primary prevention. No, I am not going to discuss about those things. And references are these. If you are interested, you can go through this. And this ends to the end of my presentation. Thank you, everyone, for your listening.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Hiroshan, for that interesting case-based discussion. So if you have any questions, you may post your questions using the Q&A tab. So let me introduce our next speaker, Dr. Bhagya Herath, acting consultant hematologist attached to DGH Navalapitiya. She is going to share her experience in managing BK cystitis, especially in haploidentical stem cell transplant setting. Over to you, Bhagya, to carry on with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nadeshani. I'm Dr. Bhagya Herath, a consultant hematologist at DGH Navalapitiya. Good evening, my dear teachers and colleagues. Today, I'm going to do a brief presentation regarding one of the most common complications we can see in haploidentical transplant patient, which is BK virus-induced hemorrhagic cystitis. First, I'm going to go through two case scenarios I had managed during my foreign experience. First patient is Mr. D.F. He's a 66 years old male patient. He was a diagnosed patient with acute monoblastic leukemia, and he was enrolled in BRIGHT trial, but patient progressed throughout the treatment, and he was treated with FLAG-IDA and achieved his first CR with FLAG-IDA treatment. After that, patient had haploidentical reduced intensity conditioning allograft for AML with fludarabine, cyclophosphamide, and total body irradiation as conditioning regime. And his day zero was, that means that day zero means the date of the stem cell infusion during the transplant. It was on 24th of December 2019. However, this patient had a very complex past medical history. He had hypertension, asthma, and coronary heart disease, for which he had multiple bypass surgeries, angiograms with multiple stents. And in addition to that, he had hyperlipidemia and CKD. Therefore, this patient, we expected to get so many post-transplant complications in this patient, and we were well prepared for that. And special features during his transplant were that we had to keep this patient's hemoglobin target around 90 grams per liter because of the ischemic heart disease. Otherwise, we normally keep 80 grams per liter as our normal hemoglobin target in other transplant patients. And unfortunately, even though we did a haplotransplant from his daughter, this patient had a poor donor mobilization and suboptimal stem cell dose harvested. Therefore, we had to infuse CD34 selected top-up cells 1 week after the transplant. Fortunately, this patient had an uneventful immediate post-transplant period, and he had engraftment, and he went home 21 days after the transplant. This patient again presented to our renal hematology triage unit day plus 23, that means 23 days of the transplant, complaining of hematuria. He had developed hematuria in the same day morning. It wasn't frank hematuria, but blood-stained urine and passed a clot at the end, and it was painful. He hadn't taken any painkillers. And on visual examination of the urine, no macroscopic hematuria, and urine was clear and no clots. He didn't have any bleeding manifestation, no suprapubic pain, loin tenderness, chest pain, SOB, or any other things. On examination, patient was comfortably lying on bed. All the other systemic examination was normal with abdominal examination. And we did basic investigations, and his platelet were 26,000 with WBC of 3.1 and hemoglobin of 100 gram per liter. His clotting profile was normal with CRP of 38. Urine culture was normal, that means no growth. Urine dipstick showed microscopic hematuria, red blood cell positivity. We suspected BK hemorrhagic cystitis in this patient, as the timing is compatible with that, and we sent blood and urine for BK, adeno, and CMV virus during that admission. And we also did an ultrasound abdomen, which is one of the most important investigation in this hemorrhagic cystitis patients. And it revealed mild irregularity in posterior wall of the bladder with bilateral renal cyst, but no clots in the bladder. So after this, as the patient was asymptomatic at that time, after discussing with consultant hematologist, we decided to send the patient home and advise him to come to our daycare unit next day for magnesium infusion with platelet transfusion and pseudoporia. Normally, we usually keep platelet more than 50,000 in patient with hemorrhagic cystitis. But as he wasn't having any macroscopic hematuria at that time, we decided to postpone platelet transfusion to the next day. So when he arrived to our daycare unit next day, without his plasma BK virus level were back, and it didn't show any BK virus, but the urine levels were still pending. But we thought, as the high suspicion of BK cystitis, we started him with the IV pseudoporia, which is an antiviral treatment and the drug of choice for BK virus hemorrhagic cystitis. And after that, we got the results, and his BK virus level was 27.8 million copies in urine. And like this, patient received platelet transfusion and weekly pseudophorias, and he received 2 doses of pseudophoria. And the patient had cleared urine, no microscopic hematuria. Patient completely improved clinically. And after sending for second BK virus level, we stopped pseudophoria, and his second BK virus level in his urine came as 113, very low. So the final diagnosis, so this patient is an uncomplicated hemorrhagic cystitis patient. And the final diagnosis is that hemorrhagic cystitis responded to pseudophoria treatment. Now, I'm going to my second case. This is a little bit complicated hemorrhagic cystitis patient. Actually, I choose this case to show the range of spectrum of hemorrhagic cystitis. And his name is S.A., 38 years old, male patient. He's a diagnosed patient with acute myeloid leukemia in 2016 in Kuwait and treated in Kuwait. And he had relapsed AML in 2018 with complex karyotype with the phenotype of mixed lineage and undifferentiated cells. Unfortunately, this patient was refractory to FLAG-IDA treatment. That means despite FLAG-IDA, he was having persistent disease. And his flow cytometry recovered, even though he was initially diagnosed as AML, blast with T acute lymphoblastic phenotype. Therefore, after several discussion rounds in our MDT, and we decided to give him nilotinib salvage. And fortunately, this patient had achieved complete remission after first cycle of nilotinib salvage. And we went for a second cycle of nilotinib salvage, and it was coupled with reduced intensity haploidentical hematopoietic stem cell transplant. And he also had a very complicated immediate post-transplant period, and his anti-leukemia therapy and post-transplant period was complicated with invasive pulmonary aspergillosis after FLAG-IDA reinduction, but responded to therapy, and bacterial chest infection with multi-resistant Klebsiella grown from bronchoalveolar lavage after FLAG-IDA reinduction, and Enterococcus faecium vancomycin resistant category bacteremia during the transplant. And in addition to that, he developed pericardial effusion, reduced left ventricular ejection fraction, impaired pulmonary function, and impaired liver function during his immediate post-transplant period. However, patient recovered from all those things, and around day 30 of post-transplant, patient went home with a successful engraftment. Again, he was readmitted in day plus 48 of transplant with macroscopic hematuria. On admission, patient was in severe pain. He was passing frank hematuria profusely with clots, dysuria, increased frequency, and suprapubic pain. And urine dipsticks, red cells, positive for red cells, and urine culture, no growth. And his hemoglobin was 94 grams per liter. Actually, when he went home, it was 100 grams per liter, and hemoglobin dropped with the hematuria. And its white cell count was 5.5 with the absolute neutrophil count of 2.9, and platelets were 69,000. His clotting profile normal with mildly elevated CRP, and ultrasound abdomen showed inflamed bladder with clots. And we also did a 2D echo because as he had past history of pericardial effusions and low ejection fraction, and he needs extensive rehydrations. But fortunately, this time he didn't have any effusions, and his ejection fraction improved to 55%. And we suspected hemorrhagic cystitis, and urine and blood sent for BK virus, adenovirus, and cytomegalovirus. And however, so when we clinically suspect hemorrhagic cystitis, without waiting for viral load results, we normally start with treatment. However, his urine BK virus came as 60 million copies, and diagnosis of hemorrhagic cystitis was confirmed. As an acute management, we inserted him with a 3-way catheter, and bladder irrigation and bladder washout started immediately. Cidofovir, which is the antiviral drug of choice, was started 1 milligram per kg once weekly dose, and it was coupled with analgesics with subcut morphine and oxybutynin and buscopan for his colicky pain. After 3 doses of cidofovir, that means normally we give it as once weekly, after 3 weeks, hematuria reduced in intensity, but it persisted. Even though we take initial urology opinion and they agreed with our initial plan, we again went for urology opinion at that time. And according to them, they said that most probably it's due to the prolonged bladder washouts and bladder irrigation giving rise to multiple bleeding points and inflamed bladder is the cause for the persisting hematuria. And they suggested him to have Elmiron, which is a pentosan polysulfate, 150 milligram BD for cystitis, and which will take around more than 1 week for his action and has to be continued more than 2 weeks to get the results. And they also, if the hematuria persists, and they also suggested to do direct cystoscopic examination and intervention with fibrin glue like things, and to transfer the patient under their care. Unfortunately, patient is adamant and he refused to undergo cystoscopy, and he opted for pharmacological management. And at the same point, we found that his cytomegalovirus levels started to rise after his admission also, not only BK virus level. Even though initial CMV was less than 150, CMV reactivation occurred, and his CMV copies went up to 2,328. Therefore, after multidisciplinary team discussion, we had to start that. Even though cidofovir is also a treatment of choice for cytomegalovirus, we had to start him with the foscarnet treatment coupled with cidofovir, because the cidofovir dose we use in BK cystitis is a lower dose than the CMV management. So this patient has 2 highly nephrotoxic drugs to these 2 viral reactivations. But as you can see in the slide, CMV level gradually went down with the foscarnet treatment. So we were able to give him 14 days of treatment dose of foscarnet with careful monitoring of GFR. And we switched over to maintenance dose after completion of 14 days. And patient was also on cyclosporin, 75 milligram Mane and 50 milligram Nocte after post-transplant for the immunosuppression. And due to this viral reactivation, we had to reduce cyclosporin to 50 milligram BD with careful assessment of chimerism because of these viral reactivations. Unfortunately, the BK virus level after the 3rd week came as 200 copies, and patients improved symptomatically with the Elmiron. Therefore, we were able to discharge the patient and arrange for clinic follow-up. So we had to face multiple challenges at that time with this patient. Patient had 2 viral reactivations, which were BK and CMV. And he also had persistent hematuria for 3 weeks with risk of bladder perforation. And patient also refused cystoscopic intervention. And past history of pericardial effusion with risk of fluid overload and heart failure. And patient also needed reduction of cyclosporine with careful assessment of risk-benefit ratio over viral reactivation and changing of chimerism. So they were the 2 patients we managed. And I'm going to tell briefly about the hemorrhagic cystitis we see during, especially in allogenic hematopoietic stem cell transplantation. But it is more common in haploidentical stem cell transplantation because of the intense immune suppression we use in that. There are 2 types of hemorrhagic cystitis, and I think you all know about the early onset hemorrhagic cystitis. It occurs typically during or within first 48 hours after the end of conditioning regime, and it is the direct toxic result of the drug metabolites and radiotherapy on the bladder mucosa. And the late onset hemorrhagic cystitis usually starts around the time of period of neutrophil engraftment, and our first patient belongs to this category, or in 2nd, 3rd month after the transplant. The second patient belongs to the last category. The concurrent presence of pro-hemorrhagic abnormalities and abnormalities of coagulation, severe thrombocytopenia, mucosal inflammation are predisposing factors for any type of hemorrhagic cystitis. And the late onset hemorrhagic cystitis is mostly due to viruses. And among the viruses, BK virus, which is a polyoma virus, is notorious to give rise to hemorrhagic cystitis. In addition to that, adenovirus, cytomegalovirus, and HHV6 have been rarely implicated. Now I'm going to tell briefly about the pathogenesis of hemorrhagic cystitis. The current pathogenic model of hemorrhagic cystitis following transplant is multifactorial. This includes the combined effects of extensive cytopathic damage of bladder mucosa layer by a high rate of replicating virus, the chemical or excitinic damage induced by conditioning regime, the donor cell immune alloreactivity targeting bladder mucosa. The clinical diagnosis of BK polyoma virus induced hemorrhagic cystitis is based on presence of clinical symptoms and signs of cystitis, such as dysuria, increased urine frequency, and low abdominal pain. The presence of macrohematuria, the demonstration of BK virus viruria with viral load more than 7 million copies. The severity of hematuria is described by 4 categories. First one is grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, and grade 4. Grade 1 means microscopic hematuria. Grade 2 means macroscopic hematuria. And grade 3 means macroscopic hematuria with clots. And grade 4 means macroscopic hematuria with clots and renal failure secondary to urinary obstruction. BK polyoma virus viremia is often detected in patients with BK hemorrhagic cystitis with viral load more than 3 to 4 log copies and in more than 2/3 of patients. The reduction of BK viruria and viremia has been correlated with clinical recovery of the hemorrhagic cystitis. The prophylaxis, but only the effective preventive measures are available for early onset hemorrhagic cystitis. They are mainly unspecific, such as hyperhydration with use of Mesna in patients who receive high dose of hyperhydration, and use of Mesna in patients who receive high dose of cyclophosphamide as part of the conditioning regime. The capacity of cyclophosphamide and its metabolite acrolein to damage the bladder mucosa, determining an inflammatory reaction, is well known, and therefore both hyperhydration and Mesna reduce the exposure of bladder mucosa to acrolein and other toxic catabolites. Now I'm going to discuss a little bit about the treatment. The most important thing is tranexamic acid is contraindicated due to risk of clot formation in hemorrhagic cystitis patients. And withdrawal of immunosuppressive drugs should be considered in appropriate setting because it has to be a careful balance between reactivation of viruses and the chimerism. For macroscopic hematuria, we need to maintain platelet more than 50,000 and correct any clotting abnormalities if the patient had any abnormalities. And mild forms can reverse with supportive treatment, but severe forms need specific treatment and interventions. So almost all the patients with severe hemorrhagic macroscopic hematuria, we start bladder irrigation and antiviral therapy if viral infection detected. So the drug of choice is cidofovir. Normally in our trust, we use low dose cidofovir 1 milligram per kg intravenously once weekly infusion without propionic acid. Because this low dose is not associated with nephrotoxicity and may provide an alternative treatment, especially in patients with cytopenias and renal impairment. And the other drugs we can use are intravenous immunoglobulin, recombinant factor 7A, hyperbaric oxygen treatment, intravesicular instillation of E-aminocapric acid, fibrin glue, methylprednisolone or formalin, cystoscopy and cauterization, and the last resort is partial or radical cystectomy. Now I'm going to tell a little bit about cidofovir. BK virus replication can be controlled more effectively by cidofovir. It is a nucleotide analog inhibiting several DNA viruses, and it is a treatment of choice for cytomegalovirus, HHV6, HSV, HV, varicella, and smallpox. And the important pharmacokinetic property of this drug is the prolonged half-life of its active metabolite. It is ranging from 15 to 64 hours. Therefore, 65 hours. Therefore, we can give this drug as a once weekly regime. Given the high risk of tubular nephrotoxicity due to cidofovir, we don't usually use cidofovir as a prophylactic treatment. We only use it as a therapeutic purpose. The nephrotoxicity can be limited by saline hydration and by use of propionic acid that inhibit the capture and transfer of cidofovir to the tubular epithelial cells of kidney. But there is no agreement on the optimal dose of cidofovir and the modality of administration and frequency of administration. Most authors suggest to use intravenous cidofovir in 3 to 5 milligrams per kg per weekly dose, and some give it as into the bladder. In our trust, our standard operation policy is to use 1 milligram per kg weekly dose without propionic acid for the BK hemorrhagic cystitis. And there are some emerging treatments such as use of mesenchymal stromal stem cells and adaptive immunotherapy. Adaptive immunotherapy means adaptive transfer of donor-derived virus-specific T cells. Normally, we use it for CMV or any other viruses in transplant, showing efficacy for the treatment of several viral infections. But due to the high cost and the complexity of the making these T cells and manufacturing, the use of it is limited. And this is summary of all the like early onset hemorrhagic cystitis and the late onset hemorrhagic cystitis, incidence, pathogenesis, diagnosis, prevention, therapy, and other things. So I think you can go through it. I'm not going to repeat again the same thing. And So that's all. Thank you very much for listening to my brief presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhagya. Thank you for your that quite informative presentation. So let's have our final presenter, Dr. Dilupa Hirimuthukoda, acting consultant hematologist attached to Base Hospital, Mahiyangani. She's going to talk about an unfamiliar entity for us, which is palliative care in hematology. So let's listen to her. Over to you, Dilupa.
Thank you, Dr. Nadishani, for your kind introduction. I'm Dilupa Hirimuthukoda, acting clinical hematologist, Base Hospital, Mahiyangani. Good evening, my dear teachers and colleagues. I'm glad to have this opportunity to discuss about my experience of palliative care in hematology. Actually, this is a broad topic. I feel it is difficult to discuss within a short period of time, but I will try my best to give an overview with some cases I dealt with. First, we'll see what is palliative care. Palliative care is the approach to improve the quality of life of patients, both adults and children, and their families who are facing problems associated with life-threatening illness. It is an essential component of integrated people-centered health services, and it can be provided at all levels of care, and it is delivered by a designated palliative care team. Usually it is comprised of doctors, nurses, healthcare assistants, pharmacists, physiotherapists, psychologists, dietitians, sometimes music therapists, and so on. The main intention of the palliative care is to relieve suffering. The suffering could be due to many reasons. It could be physical, it could be psychological, it could be social or spiritual. Physical suffering, usually most of the terminally ill patients suffer from pain, disabilities, immobility, they have issues with feeding and self-care. Those are all physical suffering. And also they suffer with many psychological issues. They are anxious about their illness and they are depressed, they are in fear of death, and they are mainly worried about how the family is coping with the bereavement. And also they have social issues like financial and social stigma, especially countries like ours, and they have residential issues, and also they think about funeral costs. So also they may suffer from many spiritual issues. The causes of suffering could be malignancies, chronic non-communicable diseases, and end-stage organ failures, like drug-resistant chronic infections like TB, HIV, and extreme birth prematurity, and extreme frailty of old age. All these are the causes of suffering patients who need palliative care. So, according to the WHO, 78% of patients who need palliative care are in low and middle income countries. Unfortunately, only 10% of them receive it. Therefore, only 14% of patients who need palliative care receive it. So if I discuss hematological conditions which require palliative care, I think you will agree with me, almost all hematological conditions are long-term and they are with us for their whole course of illness. And all malignant hematological conditions and non-malignant conditions like bone marrow failure syndromes, chronic ITP, myelofibrosis, transfusion-dependent anemias, bleeding disorders, and all these, and you will also be able to recall more than me which conditions which need palliative care in hematology patients. So the levels of palliative care could be level 1, 2, 3. The level 1 is called the preliminary palliative care. It is palliative care approach. Usually it can be provided by any staff as their general role. The second level is called general palliative care. It is provided by some staff members who have extra knowledge, training, skills, or education for palliation. And level 3 is the specialist palliative care. It is provided by a few specialized palliative care members who care. Their role is the specialist, giving the specialist palliative care. They have special skills and knowledge. So if I discuss the places where the palliative care is provided, there are several places. It could be home, it could be community. So now we may aim mainly for home or community palliative care, which reduces many unnecessary and unwanted hospital admissions, which make the both patient and the family suffering. And it could be palliative care also can be provided in healthcare centers, hospitals, or hospices. I think some of us are not much familiar. It is about the hospices. It is a place we don't have. It is in Western countries. They have a place. It is designed to give palliative care and provide facilities to have a peaceful death for patients who have terminal illnesses. So, if the different stages of palliative care, it range from simple pain relief through handling complex clinical contexts to the end of life care. However, palliative care starts at the diagnosis. It may go in parallel with treatment. Sometimes some patients, initially the palliative care may be less, but the treatments are more. But towards the end of the course of illness, they may need more palliation than active treatment. So the palliation does not mean that stop all treatment. That is the other important thing we have to realize. Also, we have to explore widely of all individual patient and it is essential to determine the required level of care because it is different in each patient and it is need to be assessed individually to give the maximum care. So I will discuss few cases who needed different levels of palliation during their course of illness. First case, Mrs. J.H. She is a 54-year-old lady with past history of colonic cancer, admitted with left upper limb pain and constipation, and X-ray revealed large bone erosion with a fracture in humerus. Further investigations revealed hypercalcemia, renal impairment, and moderate anemia. Multiple lesions were there in the skeletal survey, and the serum proteins electrophoresis revealed monoclonal band. Bone marrow, 80% plasma cells with plasmablasts. She was diagnosed as symptomatic myeloma, and she was commenced on VTD with aim to achieve a good remission. Parallelly, she was referred to the orthopedic team to manage her fracture. And also, she required significant amount of painkillers to relieve her bone pain. And then at that point, palliative care team involved. But we continued the active treatment to bring her into a remission. Fortunately, she achieved a remission with chemotherapy and she was harvested for autologous transplant. Unfortunately, while awaiting transplant, she was admitted with worsening back pain, constipation, and perineal numbness. MRI revealed soft tissue mass compressing chorda equina. Blood film revealed plasma cell leukemia. She had worsening renal functions and free light chains were rising. Unfortunately, she progressed while on treatment, second and third line of treatment for her multiple myeloma. So she had severe immunoparesis with several episodes of septicemia, and the paraspinal masses progressed while with new lesions causing paralysis of her lower limbs. So we explained the poor prognosis, and as the medical team, we didn't have anything to offer according to her clinical condition, and she also refused further treatment. And she was reviewed by the palliative team and discussed the preferred place to die, which is not familiar to us, but we did it to her and the palliative care team discussed with her. Initially, she wanted to die in the hospital. But after a few days, she changed her mind and requested to arrange die at home. So we agreed with her and tried to facilitate her and see we optimized her pain relief, sedation, fluid, feeding, and psychological support to both patient and the family. And the DNA CPR document, which is not much familiar with us, I will discuss it with later. the DNA CPR document completed, that is to prevent unnecessary unsuccessful resuscitation. We made it definite and secured with the documents, and her care was handed over to her GP and the community palliative team. So when we consider this case, you would realize that she needed different levels of palliative care throughout her course of illness. The second case, she is a 42-year-old lady, a school teacher. She's a mother of 2 children. She was investigated for chronic cough for 4 months, and she was found to have large mediastinal mass, which is about 18 centimeters with pericardial and pleural effusions. The histology was diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. I reviewed her in the clinic, and during the discussion, surprisingly, patient and family requested to arrange the surgical resection of the tumor. I tried my best to explain her that it is not possible, and as well as it is not the standard of care. She had read about lymphoma, chemotherapy, and radiotherapy side effects before she came to the clinic. So she strictly refused chemotherapy and requested only symptomatic relief and peaceful death if surgical option is not possible. So we had to explain thoroughly the good prognosis of her condition, and we can treat with curative intent, and the side effects and adverse effects of the chemotherapy are transient and can be minimized with supportive medication. So we had to spend several hours with her. Finally, she consented for chemotherapy. And then she achieved PET negative remission, and now she is back to work. We are glad. So the message I want to give is, it is the responsibility of medical team to offer the appropriate palliation to the appropriate patient. Although they have the right to refuse treatment, but proper patient education is extremely essential and important to prevent a negative impact on patients. It is our medical professionals' duty to help patients to get the proper decision and give the proper palliation at proper stage. So the case 3, she's an 86-year-old lady. She was an author who was still writing, and she was diagnosed to have acute myeloid leukemia with adverse cytogenetics. She was severely neutropenic with pneumonia and leukostasis. She had the comorbidities of ischemic heart disease, chronic kidney disease, and hypertension. We explained her the prognosis, which is poor, and the limited treatment option we have to offer. We discussed with both patient and husband, and after giving some amount of discussion and explanation about her condition, I surprised to hear her words. These were her actual words. I have had a good life. I don't want to suffer. Only thing I want is to say goodbye and give the final hug to my daughter who is being treated for a cancer. I only want to live till that. I want to die at hospital, and that is to minimize the disturbance to her family. And she said that she feels comfortable when she's surrounded by the ward staff, and she pleased asking to prevent her suffering from pain and asked us to join the haven with her. So we discussed the DNA CPR, that is to prevent unnecessary resuscitation. And then she discussed her funeral plan with the husband. And then we decided to give the end of life care to make her comfortable. And we stopped all the blood tests. But at the same time, we gave hydration, sedation, analgesia, as well as the psychological support to both her and the husband and the family as well. She died peacefully after about 6 days. So this is her story. Then she required palliative care at that stage. So it is the patient's right to know about the diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment options, because the caring physician actually has the duty to discuss it clearly with patients and their family for them to get correct decision on their lives. Because most patients like to plan the short period of life when they are diagnosed with a life-threatening or terminal illness. They want to know the limitations of care and the success rate of the treatment option. I think it is universally true for all of our patients. Once they realize, most of them would opt to minimize suffering-free life, and to have a peaceful death. I think they deserve the best palliative care. So I will discuss. These are the 3 cases who require different extent of palliative care during their course of illness. So for your knowledge, I will just discuss the DNA CPR. It is the document, it's a legal document signed by the treating physician to avoid unsuccessful resuscitation. Before completing this document, this is to document that patient is not for resuscitation, but it does not mean that she does not receive any supportive medication. So we have to discuss with the patient and family about the possible outcome of the resuscitation as well as the outcome from ITU. And we have to consider the current medical condition as well as the underlying comorbidities which may give the impact on the outcome. So I'm sure most patients who understand poor outcome, if they have capacity, will opt for no CPR. These are some words of the patients who I discussed CPR. Some said, I don't want anyone jumping on my chest at my last minute of life. And some said, I want my dignity to be maintained till last minute. And one said, I can't imagine the pain when someone pressing on my chest with their full energy for unsuccessful achievement. I don't want to experience the pain of broken ribs at my time of death. Those were the words when we discussed the CPR and discussed the options for palliation. So this, what I want to discuss here within Sri Lanka, for our patients, this level of discussion not happen, unfortunately, due to our culture. It is important to educate the family, at least, I suppose. But if we give the chance to our patients and if we educate our patients, if we touch the base with their problems, I'm sure most patients with terminally ill will also express the same. So this will minimize the suffering of our patients, and that is the sole aim of palliative care. So I think we are somewhat there, but we are long ahead away. So if I discuss some about end of life care, which is the caring of patients who are terminally ill, incurable, and spending their last days, months, or the year of their lives. The optimum palliation is the aim of end of life care. So the patient tailored care is given, and the aim is to minimize prolongation of suffering and calm and peaceful last days of life ensured. With my experience during the COVID pandemic, more than 90% of hematological patients we had to give end of life care, unfortunately. So it is the story of our patients, hematology patients during COVID-19. So before I stop, all humans with incurable, life-threatening terminal illnesses deserve best possible palliative care. That is the message, overall message I want to give. And I hope you have got a small overall idea. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Dirupa, for that interesting presentation. So let's move on to the Q&A. The first, there's a question for Dr. Hirosha. Dr. Hirosha, someone is keen to know about your patient, whether you have stopped hydroxyurea when you have started her on the transfusion program.
Thank you, Nadishani. For this patient, hydroxyurea had been started at the early childhood due to a severe clinical phenotype. So before the onset of first stroke at the age of 14 years, she was only on on-demand transfusion, especially during hemolytic crisis and hospital admissions. So once a sickle cell patient develops a stroke, there is a high chance of getting a second stroke. So we should not give the instead of on-demand transfusion, we should establish her on regular simple transfusion. So for this girl, we continued her routine medication. By that time, those were hydroxyurea, folic acid, penicillin prophylaxis, and some calcium carbonate. And in addition to that, instead of on-demand transfusion, we have established on regular transfusions to maintain hemoglobin above 9. To maintain hemoglobin above 9 gram per deciliter all the time, and to reduce and to maintain the hemoglobin less than 30% until the next transfusion. That is for prevention of another recurrence of CNS manifestations. I hope you got the answer for your question.
Okay, thank you, Hirosha. Since we are running short of time, let me ask just one question from Bhagya. Bhagya, there's one question for you. How do you adjust doses of cidofovir at the presence of renal failure? So you said that you are monitoring creatinine. So if creatinine is going up, how do you adjust doses?
So actually this patient, if we talk about the second case, that patient had cidofovir, foscarnet, and cyclosporine. All the three drugs can cause increased creatinine and altered level of GFR. Normally, the dose we use in our trust, that is 1 milligram per kg once weekly dose, is a dose we can use when even a patient has slight derangement of the GFR, because it is very less nephrotoxic dose. But if this patient develop increased serum creatinine or reducing of GFR level while only on that small dose of cidofovir, we would take our opinion from our pharmacologist, and we would usually go for the probane acid and see and increase hydration, whether it will reduce the nephrotoxicity of the cidofovir. And on the other hand, if for the second patient, like patient who needed foscarnet, cidofovir, and who was also on cyclosporine, we will reduce the cyclosporine levels depending on the chimerism studies. And the foscarnet also we can change over to, according to the GFR, we can reduce the foscarnet level. And in the if in extreme cases, if the CMV levels are going down, we can, after discussion with MDT teams and microbiologist and the pharmacology team, we can consider to change over to prophylactic dose from the treatment dose in extreme cases without completing of 14 days. But it is very less likely to have altered level of serum creatinine only with a small dose of cidofovir.
Thank you, Bhagya. Thank you so much. So this brings us to the end of today's program, and thank you, and hope you have gathered this helped you to broaden your knowledge. So let me thank all our speakers for your busy schedules. Thank you, Dr. Hirosha Fernando, Dr. Bhagya Herath, and Dr. Dilupa. So as always, my sincere thanks goes to Cydus for their technical support. Thank you all for joining today. Good night.